Okay, we are just afternoon, so I'm going to open it up. My name is Adrienne Burney. I'm the outreach coordinator for the State Archives, and I'm very excited that we'll get to learn more about a research project that's been going on for several years, and I think ongoing, but they've done a lot of work. My colleagues at the North Carolina State Capitol have done a lot of work in our collection, so we're going to learn more from them and from a colleague here at the State Archives about one of the collections that was most fruitful for their research. But before I introduce our panelists, I want to invite you all to make your own discoveries in the State Archives collection. Our collections are vast. Our best estimate is we have over 100 million records. A small portion of those, a growing portion, is online, digitized in our digital collection. And we're open for in-person visits 5 days a week at our headquarters in Raleigh, Tuesday through Friday, 9 to 5, and Saturdays, 9 to 1. And we have 2 branches, one in Asheville, the Western Regional Archives, and another in Manteo, the Outer Banks History Center. And those are also open 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, 9 to 2. So please visit us. Please explore our collections online. We also post audiovisuals on our Flickr account and our YouTube account. So we have a lot of different resources for you to explore, but let's learn more about the ones at hand today. And we'll be hearing from Alex Dowrey, who is the archivist for state agency records. The site administrator for the North Carolina State Capitol is Terra Schramm. Deadmon is the museum curator at the Capitol, and Natalie Rodriguez is the education coordinator. And we'll get started with Alex.
Hi, everyone. So as Adrienne mentioned, my name is Alexandra Dowrey. I'm the State Agency Records Description Archivist here at the State Archives. And so before we get into the research my co-presenters have done at the State Capitol, I'm going to just provide a brief background and some context for the records in the State Archives that pertain to the State Capitol construction. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So essentially, the records that pertain to the construction of the State Capitol are from our Capitol Building series or grouping of records. These are found in the Treasurers and Comptrollers papers. These records are primarily financial in nature, and they actually contain some of the earliest records that we have. The main body of these records was transferred around 1920, 1922 to the North Carolina Historical Commission, which was essentially the precursor for the Archives and History Department. And this record group contains records that date as early as 1682 in our Ports and Shipping Records series. These records were initially processed in the 1960s, and it's essentially a catch-all collection for early financial records. They come from the Office of the State Comptroller and the Office of the State Treasurer. And when these records came to us, it was so intermingled from the two offices, and all of the records were financial in nature. So it was really difficult to distinguish between the two offices. So the decision was made to process them and treat them as one collection called the Treasurers and Comptrollers papers. So as we were looking ahead for America 250 programming, we decided to undertake a reprocessing project of this series. The collection really hadn't been touched from a description standpoint or a preservation standpoint since the 1960s. And when we took on this project, we really took on this social history inspired approach. We were really trying to think about groups or communities that may not have received as much attention in the 1970s bicentennial celebrations, and that wouldn't have really received as much description in the original finding aid. Because we viewed financial records as this place where you might encounter individuals who might not otherwise leave archival traces like diaries or letters, that kind of thing. I think one such group would be enslaved persons. And if you could go to the next slide. And so essentially the Capitol Building series is one series where we did encounter mentions of enslaved persons in the records. I should mention that this is Capitol with an A because this is not just records about the state capitol, but it is about essentially the buildings in the state capitol complex, like the government buildings. So it also includes records for the state house prior to the state capitol, Tryon Palace, the governor's building, that kind of thing. And these records relate to the building, maintenance, upkeep, and furnishing of these government buildings. And, oh, if you could go to the next slide, please. So for researchers who are using this collection, we definitely want to point out there are some folders that specifically call out enslaved labor. So this example from our catalog here is the labor's pay and enslaved labor folder. And this is how the records were originally arranged and came to us from the 1960s processing. So at first glance, you might think that perhaps just these folders and there's another volume relating to enslaved persons. You might think that maybe those are the only ones that contain references, but due to the nature of these records with like the receipts and various things, references to enslaved labor at the Capitol are spread throughout many of the folders in this series. So for someone doing research, you definitely want to make, be made aware of that. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do is, you can see in this catalog record, we've mentioned and made it apparent to researchers that, you can find these references throughout the series. And with the original description from the 1960s, it basically was just a folder list. So we're definitely trying to make it more apparent for researchers, like, the nature of the records and like what they can find. Next slide, please. So the focus of this webinar really is on the stories of the enslaved men who built and maintained the state capitol. But before we move into that, I just want to mention a few other series for the Treasurer and Comptroller's papers where we did come across substantial references to enslaved persons in this records. So one of these is the Lands, Estates, Boundaries, and Surveys series. It deals a lot with confiscated lands during the American Revolution and other early land records. Next slide. And so one of the things that's interesting is with the original finding aid, it talked about confiscated lands. But when we got into processing these collections, what we really discovered was confiscated lands actually meant confiscated property. And as enslaved persons were viewed as property, we came across quite a few references to enslaved persons and the names of them in these records. Next slide. And one of the things that we've been doing as we've been working on this reprocessing is we've been working on keeping a spreadsheet where we're recording the names of the enslaved persons we're coming across and, the location in the record, if we have any additional information on like the enslaver and that kind of information. At the moment, this is just an internal document, but we are hoping to be able to do something in the future with it. So it's really been a work in progress. But as you can see with the confiscated lands, we came across a lot of references to enslaved persons. Next slide, please. And another series that we came across that had a lot of references to enslaved persons was our port series. This has a lot of records on shipping, accounts, that sort of thing. But what we discovered was that this series really documents the transatlantic and trans-American trafficking of enslaved persons. And there's a little more information in our catalog record. If anyone wants more information, they can certainly pull that up. Next slide. And then another series too, where we came across enslaved persons was the Internal Improvements series. And in this, we can really see additional enslaved labor on state-sanctioned infrastructure projects. So enslaved persons weren't only, working on the Capitol, but they were also working on other state infrastructure projects like canals and that sort of thing. And that's really what you find in this series. Next slide. And then another really good series for finding more records on enslaved persons is our miscellaneous group. It kind of encompasses a lot of things that didn't quite fit in the other series. There's records about escape, emancipation, hiring out, sales. Also like to mention that there is a content warning for the records in this series because we have records from the Magistrates and Freeholders Court, and there is some references to execution. So to just be aware if you're working with these series. Next slide. So yeah, and in my presentation today, I've included a lot of catalog records. You can pull them up yourself on Doc, which is our online catalog. I've included the website here, but if you go on the State Archives main website, there should be a bar right at the top that says Search Doc. And also, if you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to us. I've included the email address and the phone number for our search room staff. They're perfectly happy to help with, any research questions that you might have. Also, I've talked about this Excel spreadsheet we've been keeping about the names of enslaved persons. As I mentioned, it's an internal document at the moment, but if anyone's doing any kind of like genealogical research or like working in these records and would like access to it, certainly please reach out. If it comes through the search room, they can certainly get the information to us, and we're happy to have that available. And, I think with the work that we do, we're really excited to see people do things with our records. We work to make them accessible and discoverable. So that way, people like my co-presenters at the state capitol can really do this really important research that they've been doing. And so I'd like to turn it over to my presenters from the state capitol.
Thank you, Alex. That was a really wonderful overview of all the records, not all the records, but some of the records that are available at the state archives. I want to take a second to thank Adrian for inviting us to be here. We're thrilled to be able to share this project and our process, and feel really lucky to have such great colleagues just across the street at our state archives. So we were introduced at the beginning, but I'm Terra Schramm. I'm the site administrator. I'm joined here today with Deadmon and Natalie Rodriguez. We are the research team here for the From Naming to Knowing, Uncovering Slavery at the North Carolina State Capitol. We make up just half of the museum staff here at the state capitol. And while the North Carolina General Assembly no longer meets here in this building, it still houses the office of the governor and is considered the active capital of the state. So our staff has the privilege of overseeing the visitor services, the interpretive programs. We care for the building and for the historic collections. We do special events. And then sometimes we get to do research as well in the state archives. So I am joining you today. We're joining you today from the state capitol, although we are under construction. So I will apologize in advance if you hear any construction noise. That's why I have this real good background today. So the photos that you're seeing here, this is our building. This is the North Carolina State Capitol, both an exterior and an interior view. This building opened in June of 1840. And historically, this building was home to all of our state government. So from 1840 until 1888, it housed the Supreme Court. In 1960 is when the North Carolina General Assembly moved out. And as I mentioned, it's still home to the office of the governor. Following the departure of the General Assembly in the 60s, the building was restored to its mid-19th century appearance. And the interpretation at that time really focused on the architecture and a glorified antebellum and Civil War narrative. So for many, many years, there was no mention at all of slavery or any of the enslaved African Americans who built this building. And I will say over the past, 15 or so years, our interpretation has evolved to include mention of enslaved people, but we just didn't know a lot of specifics. So we were really talking in general terms about this group of people. We know enslaved people were here. We don't know exactly what they were doing. So that provided us an opening to dig a little bit deeper. So in 2019, our research team began really making it a priority to do the research and find the documentation and dig in the archives to find the stories of these people who were here. So right now we know of 137 enslaved men, most of whom worked here during the building's construction between 1833 and 1840. So we've used tons of sources, many sources. to gather information about all these individuals, and also learning about the free Black craftsmen who worked on the building as well. But our goal with this research was to build a publicly accessible website, which you see here, From Naming to Knowing. And we just debuted the site. We made it public this week, on Monday, actually. So y'all are our first presentation since the project, since the site went live. So we're thrilled to be able to share it. But today, we're talking about some of the archival sources that we use to research and put together these stories of the enslaved people. It's important for us to acknowledge that researching the lives of enslaved African Americans is often a very frustrating and complicated process. Primary sources are very, very privileged towards white people who were often enslavers. These are the people who are creating the records, and then those are the records that are deemed to be important to be saved in archives. So we just wanted to be sure to acknowledge that. Our research has proven that African Americans had a significant impact on the state capitol and on the community of Raleigh. We see this as a project that is acknowledging the skill and the humanity of those workers in a space where that history for many years was intentionally erased. We say often around here that the slavery story was not hidden history. It was deemed unimportant by those who were creating the narrative. And so what we found is once we started looking for these stories, you find what you seek. Once we started looking for these stories, we saw time and time again that slavery was acknowledged in the historical record. It was just forgotten. So our goal is to surface those stories once again, because they are truly very important to our understanding of the history of not just this building, but this community. So today in our presentation, we'll be discussing some of the figures that we feel we have gotten to know over the course of our research. And these are the men whose skill and labor built the state capitol. So the way we have moved through the documents, we really see this primarily as a genealogical project. Certainly we're telling the story of a place and a building, but we are really working to highlight individuals and the stories of their lives. So I'm going to pass it along to Kara to show how we got started on this research.
Thanks, Tara. Thank you everyone again for joining us today. I'm Kara Deadmon. I'm the museum curator here at the State Capitol. And so, like Tara said, we're really going to be diving into several of the archival sources that we used for this research and for this work. So it kind of began with, again, this wasn't hidden from us or anything, but I'm going to say the discovery of a document. So this is the report of the commissioners appointed to superintend the rebuilding of the state capitol. So the first state house that stood on our square burnt in 1831. And throughout the 1830s, the General Assembly and appointed commissioners were rebuilding, were thinking about rebuilding, et cetera. So this document was produced in 1834 after construction on the Capitol had begun. And it was basically showing a moment in time. So it was showing who was working at the Capitol's construction project at this moment in 1834. So when we saw this document, actually, this is probably the nerdiest thing that I've ever said, but I was checking footnotes in a secondary source, and one of the footnotes from Elizabeth Reed Murray, she's a local historian, writes about Wake County. One of the footnotes mentioned this 1834 report, and I thought, I've never heard of that report. I don't know what it entails. So I went looking. It was digitized in the state archives. The link was on the page, on the slide just prior. So it was, kind of right there in front of us when we went looking for it, when we just knew what to look for. So this document, again, lists those men who were involved in the construction at this moment in 1834. It was being produced as kind of like a note to the assembly. This is what we're doing. This is who's involved in the construction. And when we located this document, it was the first time that we had ever seen some of these names. Others we knew, we had seen names before, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, other archival sources that we had located these names in. But it was really also the first time that we had seen individuals noted as enslaved people working on the project. So you can see the document here. These are two places where enslaved people's names are listed. So it says both first and last name. It has wages per day. It has the word slave after their name, noting an enslaved person. And it breaks it down by what type of labor they were doing. So this list of laborers is probably general construction labor here at the Capitol site. The Capitol, as you saw in the photograph earlier, it's a big stone building. So the stone was actually locally quarried from a state-operated quarry here in Raleigh. And so there's also contained within this 1834 document, this list of quarrymen. So these individuals were working at the state quarry doing the work of quarrying stone for the building. Again, this kind of was a eureka moment for us. And from this document alone, we had about 90 names suddenly of enslaved people who some we had seen before, some we had never seen before, but notably first and last name, right? So we were kind of able to create this project, get started with this work, with this list of names. Okay, so now we have these names. What else can we find about these individuals? Who are they connected to? Who were their enslavers? Where did they live? Were they local? All of these questions emerged pretty much immediately upon locating this document. Just as an overview before we dive in a little bit more, we wanted to express that though this 1834 document was kind of the kickoff to this project, when you're starting this type of research project, it might not always serve you to immediately dive into the minutia. So looking at very particular, small, specific documents. So if you're doing a research project about an individual, a family, or a community, you can often explore the written and colloquial history of an area. And so that's what I'm calling like secondary-ish sources. So if you have a rough idea of the geographical community you want to explore, where somebody was living, who they were connected to, you can take a look and see if there are these synthesized histories already produced from that area, right? So the archives does have these. There is a lovely curated Raleigh history collection. So we're thinking about the Capitol, but we're also thinking about the community of Raleigh during this time period, right? So who was living here? How were they connected to each other? And these sources were instrumental in the early days of looking at this network of people, all of these individuals that were connected to this project. So obviously, these types of sources, these are written later, reflections back on the history of Raleigh. You obviously have to take a look at who's writing these, take them with a grain of salt, right? These are prominent citizens. They have an agenda when they're writing things. They weren't there. They're reflecting back. They're creating a narrative just like every other historian. So it might be a misrepresentation of exactly what happened, but it's helpful, and it was helpful to us looking at kind of broad strokes of the community. And it really benefited us to have a knowledge and an understanding of the community of Raleigh of this time period in order to contextualize the lives of the people that we were diving into. All right. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Natalie.
Hi, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Kara, for that. That was wonderful segue into what we're talking about in regards to the sources we use and how we use them. So one thing that was very helpful in our research in doing this work was community maps. Community maps really provided a spatial awareness of where many enslavers were located, therefore where the enslaved people were located in proximity to the Capitol's construction. This gave us an understanding of the relationships, especially with enslavers, their neighbors, maybe proximity to family members. There are some other source materials we'll get into a little later that provided information for us. Given we had first and last names, as Kara mentioned before, we were in most cases, due to other sources like time books, able to locate enslavers of these people. So with that, we were able to use maps from the Raleigh History Collection, the digital, and we used 3 prominent maps. We have 2 here on the slide right now, but we used the 1817 map of Raleigh, the 1834, and then the 1847 map. And that provided us proximity because in these maps, there are blocks and it provides the names of the property owners. So we are able to place where the property owners are here in the downtown area. Of course, we do have other records we use, but the map provided so much more detail and understanding of how not only the enslavers were, but the proximity of how the enslaved people had to navigate the space around Raleigh and the Capitol's construction project. So with that, we were also able to understand if we had, let's just say, an enslaver signing for wages for an enslaved person, well, who is this other person signing for them? We find out later that it was their neighbor because of maps and information like this. So with that, if you are, approaching research that involves whether it's any type of research, I would just suggest maps can be very helpful in understanding where people are, where they moved around in over time. Unfortunately, there are instances where people are bought and sold amongst community members. So that provided us also a way to trace where people moved in the city of Raleigh. And so with that, we're going to move forward to our next slide and get into some more state archival documents we use from the Treasurer and Comptroller records. So the Treasurer and Comptroller records held receipts that provided more information about enslavers and who they enslaved, when or why they were asking for wages at a certain point, who they were allowing to pick up wages for them. So in this instance here, we have a few different images of records from the state archives. And so you can see from different receipts, we have one for a Glasgow Saunders, right here in the corner. In deep painting, he was head of the project at one point, so that's why his name is on a lot of these receipts. And we see that throughout a lot of the documents. You see names of enslaved men and the wages that occurred for a certain period. And we even have a letter from a enslaver, Mary Wheaton, who is asking for her wages or the wages that her enslaver earned, of course, because unfortunately at the end of the day, enslaved people did not get those wages. Their enslavers did, right? Because their enslavers were renting out their labor for this project. And we see that, of course, is evident in these source materials. So with that, I'm just gonna get into our next slide, which delves a little deeper into some of the stories, narratives we were able to create from these very important archival materials that helped us create narratives. So just before, as we mentioned, we use maps. Here is a map of where Martha Wheaton would have been living at the time. So if you look for, Mary Wheaton, excuse me, a lot of old names, Martha, Mary, they all get mixed up sometimes. But anyways, you see on block 32, that is where she's residing. So then we can place where Alfred Wheaton, our enslaved person that she enslaved, was in proximity to the Capitol. It's very close. You see Nash Square in close proximity as well. Of course, we have the letter and the comptroller records. We also have Martha writing for these wages, right? And she's wanting these type of financial income, right? We have women enslavers too. It's not just men. That's something else that it provides more context to our narratives and who these people were and kind of how they had to navigate these spaces here with their enslavers or with the project as well. So with that, we hope that you will actually go on the website and read his narrative. I won't go too much into his narrative because we're really talking about the source materials we use from archives, but please take a moment, read his narrative, and you'll find out how wonderful many of these stories are and how we're going from naming to knowing. But with that, we're going to move on to our next slide, and I'm going to pass it on over. This is, oh, I'm sorry. These are some other records, and Kira, I'm going to pass it on to Kira to kind of give us some more in-depth explanation of how we use these.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. So Natalie was just talking about the treasurers and comptrollers records. Alex kind of introduced you to these records before. So in addition to things like the receipts that you saw, we were also able to locate enslaved people in these that you see on your screen now. So these are ledgers. We call them the time books. They are daily ledgers of every person who was working at the construction project of the state capitol in any capacity. So there are separate ledgers for those individuals working at the quarry, for those that were here doing general labor at the construction site. Each of these 2 pages shows 2 weeks worth of time in the construction. You can see the names of those individuals working here are listed, and then the little tick marks show you each day that they were present. So the time books were even noting, you know, if someone was only present for half a day or a quarter of the day, because these were how those employed by the state were tracking compensation. So for each day that they were working, this is the compensation that they were allotted. And for us, this was the place that we were able to verify connections between an enslaved person and an enslaver. So the last column over here is who is signing to pick up the compensation. So for a white person or for a free person of color, they might be signing for themselves, right? But for an enslaved person, the enslaver was signing to pick up the compensation. Like Natalie mentioned, enslavers were hiring out their enslaved laborers to this project. So they were the ones that were picking up the compensation. So we were able to use the time books again to verify a lot of the connections between enslaved person and enslaver. These were in a lot of circumstances, connections that we already knew or suspected. But again, this was where we were able to show the signature of the enslaver, you know, picking up the compensation for their enslaved person and benefiting from that enslaved person's labor. The time books also showed us connections that we didn't previously suspect, right? So circumstances where an enslaved person had a different surname than their enslaver at that point. I believe this was mentioned earlier. There were also circumstances where we think that a neighbor of an enslaver was picking up the compensation for, you know, various people and probably taking that money back to their neighbor. So we used the time books extensively. We're actually attempting currently to catalog every name in an internal spreadsheet so that we can easily go through and search who was working here on what day. And we also use the time book to tell some parts of individual stories. So one individual that we tell the story of on the website is a man named Junius Brickle. We knew a little bit about Junius prior to the time books because his enslaver was a woman named Martha Brickle, and she wrote many little notes that were held in the receipts collection in the treasurers and comptrollers papers, asking for Junius's wages. So, you know, she's saying in these little notes, please pay Junius his wages for this time. We also knew where Martha Brickle was living because of the maps that we mentioned earlier. It showed her property northwest of the Capitol building. So we know that, Junius was probably walking here to the Capitol from Martha Brickell's property. But lastly, one thing that we discovered about Junius and his story was that he was actually allowed to make his own mark in the time books. So Junius, you see here with the red arrow, it says his name, Junius Brickell, and then in the center, it says his mark with an X. So, this was more unusual. You don't see a lot of circumstances where an enslaved person was able to sign for their own compensation. We don't know exactly what this meant for Junius. This might have meant that he was keeping some of that money, right? He was allowed to keep and control some of the money that his labor was making. Or he might have just been picking it up and taking it back to Martha Brickell so that she could keep those wages. So, I admit it was a bit emotional seeing this, right? Like seeing where Junius himself marked on this page after spending so much time researching the lives of these individuals, to be able to see something that to hold in our hands, something that they physically touched was moving. But yeah, so this just adds another layer to the story of Junius Brickell. And now I will turn it back to Tara.
Thanks, Kara. We wanted to definitely make sure we mention family papers, of course, which may seem like an obvious choice when you are doing genealogy, but there's certainly a lot of records there. And so, we looked at people that we knew who were involved in the Capitol itself or in the project, and took a dive through their family papers, sometimes finding things and sometimes not. But the one example I wanted to highlight today are the papers of Governor David Stone, which led us to the records of Sarah Stone, who is his wife. Sarah Dashiell Stone was Governor Stone's second wife. They resided mostly at Restdale, the Stone Plantation here in Wake County, which was about 10 miles from downtown Raleigh. And after Governor Stone's death in 1818, Sarah continued to live at Restdale. And then we know from our maps, as Natalie referenced, that a map in 1834 shows that she was owning property along Fayetteville Street, so just adjacent to the state capitol. So the images that you see here are located in the Stone family papers. It's a diary that Sarah Stone kept, and it had many notes, diary entries, that sort of a thing. But luckily for us, she also recorded the names and the birth dates of the people that she enslaved. So the second image is just the enlarged left page there of the diary. And you can see it says 1819, my Negroes' ages. I wanted to point out, if you look about 6 names down on the image on the right, you'll see the name of Giles. And Giles is a name that we recognize from the 1834 report. And what you see here is that she lists his birthday as the 9th of October, 1815, which means that Giles was about 18 or 19 years old when he started working in the state quarry. And so that also, when you have an age and you can place a person at a place, that's also can be a bit of an emotional moment to see. It helps you picture their life a little bit more. You can also see listed in her diary, she lists Sarah also enslaved a couple other people that she hired out to the Capitol project, Caesar, Reuben, and Robin. They all worked at the Capitol, and their names are on in her diary as well. Another really important source for us, held by the state archives, are will and probate records that we accessed via ancestry.com. So they're digitized, which is very helpful. A lot of this work we did when we were working at home during COVID. So we were very grateful that those are digitized. But once again, using Sarah Stone as an example, we located her will in the archives. And so you'll see the names from the 1834 report there on the left. There's a newspaper ad advertising the sale of her property after she has passed away. And then the bottom image is of an excerpt of her will. And she names Giles in the will. She dies in 1838, and 46 of her enslaved people were to be sold at auction. She stipulated that she wanted them to be sold as families, We don't know if that happened or not, but Giles is named in the will along with Reuben and Robin, so that may indicate some sort of family relationship. Another thing we encountered often was expecting to find an enslaved person's name in a will and not finding it. And so then we learned either they sold, maybe they self-emancipated, but that was an important thing for us to figure out as well, is that that provided maybe not the answer we were looking for, but certainly another avenue to look through. So and finally, I also did want to mention that we did find some of the wills of formerly enslaved people in the state archive. So if they survived to see emancipation, we were able to locate some of their wills in our state archives. Handy Lockhart comes to mind. And this is, of course, very important in helping us learn more about their lives after slavery. What did their lives look like? Because they name family members, they have witnesses signing the will, and we see parcels of property being discussed. And so that helps give us a fuller picture of their life after emancipation as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Kara.
So today we have presented to you all some of the archival sources that we used in the process of creating the individual narratives that are now presented on Naming to Knowing. And we were able to do a good portion of this research because our state archives are so accessible, right? So luckily, so many of these resources have been digitized. Terra referenced, we were able to access a lot of them during the pandemic, even when everything was closed. And also, you know, we're lucky at the Capitol. If we need something from the archives, the search room is across the street from us, so we can just walk over. And we were able to see a lot because, again, our archives are so accessible. So we're striving to interpret this legacy and enslaved people who worked here at the Capitol as fully as possible. But again, we just want to reiterate that it's sometimes very difficult, hard to do because of the privileged nature of these records. These types of historic records were not being produced by people held in bondage. They were being produced by white people, by enslavers themselves. So we're looking for bits and pieces. We're trying to piece together the lives of enslaved people from the perspective of those enslavers, right? So they're being written about. They're most often not the ones producing the records that we go to. So it's likely we'll never know everything about these individuals. It will be impossible for us to know their lives fully. However, we do consider this project to be evergreen, right? We will continue to research. We will continue to attempt to piece together the lives of enslaved people who built and maintained the Capitol. This is a process that we never see as complete. It will never be complete. We will continue. And now that the website is live, it's our hope that if you have information, if individuals in the community know some of these names, have information to add, knowledge of the individuals we list, we really are hopeful that folks will come forward, help us fill in the gaps. Yeah, let us know what you know. And obviously, please take a look at our research and share it far and wide. So we thank you very much. And I think now we would like to open it up to questions. If anyone has questions for us, for any of us from at the Capitol or from Alex as well. Yeah, we would love to answer questions about our efforts.
Thank you all so much for that great presentation. And I also want to thank some colleagues who are putting additional resources into the chat. So check out all those different websites if you're interested. But we have one question in the chat so far. What vision do you all have for for the public using your new website, and whether the stories can be accessed by school students and other groups?
Yeah.
I'll just
Yeah,
mention.
yeah, go ahead.
I'll mention and then I'll hand it off to Natalie. So on the website, if you go under, about the project, the FAQs, there is an FAQ that addresses what resources we have for educators. So there are two lesson plans available there. And then Natalie can speak to other virtual presentations that we do.
Oh, I was just gonna say what you were gonna say, and before we even did this website, we did listening sessions, and we had educators reach out or just provide input on like how we could be of or a resource to them. So that's something we listen to, and so this is something we want to talk to school groups about and provide this information. So we're really excited to do so. And I see another question as well. I saw curious to learn if the project has uncovered unique information about enslaved women and girls involved in the construction project. This is from Chrissy Anger, Western Carolina University. So thank you for that question. I appreciate that. That we've been asked that question, as well as if we found any Native Americans part of this project as well. And to answer your question, so far, no. And I say that to say, we don't know what we'll uncover in the future. This is an ongoing project. We are working for research. So far, we have not seen or uncovered research that has had women or females involved. To say that, we have seen notations of a boy, a child, and so that's something we have found in our research. We have in some of our narratives talked about the women of these enslaved men that maybe get to emancipation and they're able to have those lives with their families or their children. So we do bring women and girls' narratives into our stories on our website. And I don't know, Tara, if y'all want to add anything to that as well.
No, that's absolutely it. We know that that is a glaring hole in this research, that we don't have extensive stories of women here. We don't, again, we can make those kind of broad statements. We know that women were probably here working in some capacity, but we're not sure what they were doing. So far, we haven't seen them listed in the official state records, like the time books, that sort of thing. It was men that were generating compensation for their work here. As Natalie mentioned, we do know of a couple circumstances where the official state records note children working here, so enslaved children. We also know in a lot of cases, those individuals that were considered men at the time were what we would call children now, so teenagers. But yes, if we know of connections, family connections to women within an individual's story, we definitely note that on the website. But yeah, hopefully we will uncover more about the women who are in this space in the future.
Okay, so I see a question that might be more for one of our archivists, either Alex or someone else. Have City of Raleigh court case records been digitized and used maybe for this project? And if so, where are those housed?
So I guess I can chime in about from an archival side. I know we have county records here. So potentially like Wake County, and a lot of our county records are available through Family Search. I'm not as familiar about specific city records. That would actually be a really great question for our reference staff. I work with state agency records, not city records, but I do know we have county records available, and those are available online they've been digitized through Family Search and like on ancestry.com.
On a researcher side, I can say not particularly court case records, but in regards to Wake County, not the city of Raleigh, unfortunately, we've used the Slave Deeds Project in searching a lot of our enslaved individuals, and that's been very helpful to see like deeds of sales between community members. And so with that, we have used other resources outside of state archives to do this work. We've used the Library of Congress records. We've used so many different archival materials in different spaces. So sometimes it's been city, county, state, or just, national records. And so with that, that'll be something to look into, but yeah.
I see a couple more questions. One question in the Q&A is, will this project be uploaded and placed into a webpage, uploaded and updated regularly, in such a way that when new information is found on each person, it can be updated on the website on a regular basis? Yes, thank you, Tony. Yes. So namingtoknowing.org, that was the URL that I put in the chat earlier. That is our new website. It was just went live this week. And that is where you can find all of the known names of the enslaved laborers who built, maintained, and then later worked in the state capitol. And that is where you can find the stories that we were referencing. So if we knew a little bit more about an individual, we tried to synthesize that information into a narrative for them. And those stories are present on the website. So you can go, you can move through, you can learn more about the stories of the individuals that we mentioned today: Alfred Wheaton, Junius Brickell, Giles Stone, and learn a little bit more about this project. But we absolutely consider this project to be evergreen. So we'll keep updating the website. You can sign up for our newsletter and we will send out updates. Hey, there's a new story that's live on the website. And that's our intention.
And to add to Kara's point, with every story, someone asked this question: are there sources? Do we cite? We do, and we provide those sources. We wanted this project to be one in which it was accessible to our public and to go and look through these records themselves. And that's one reason why we're here today. We're talking about how you can access these records, right? And that's what we want you to do. Someone also asked, were you able to connect any of the enslaved people to enslavers or locations outside the immediate area around the Capitol and the building? Yes, that's a great question. Many of our enslavers were wealthy, prominent, and they held land outside of Wake County, sometimes even outside of the state. We're finding instances where we have the movement of enslaved people from different communities outside of Raleigh and Wake County. So that has expanded our search in ways where we can't just look for these people in Wake County, especially after emancipation. They have the freedom to move at that point. So we have found instances where after or with their emancipation, they're living somewhere else outside of Raleigh. And not all the time. Some of our individuals do stay in Wake County.
I saw that Sarah Kuntz mentioned the People Not Property Project page, and that was one of the many sources that we used as we're trying to construct these narratives. So the archives is a great place, but there are so many other places to look for this information. I'll also shout out the Wake County Register of Deeds, the Enslaved Persons Project, that has transcribed the deeds of sale. That was hugely important to us as well. So there's a lot out there, and we're hoping that this helps inspire you to look.
So I see a comment in the chat about the free people of color that appear on some of the records. And do you have any plans to interpret that group or add it to the website in some way?
Yes. So currently, the website also includes these thematic history essays. If you go to the menu at the top, it says history. So these were just topics that we wanted to further explain, either a theme that we saw was present in the stories of more than one person, or something we just wanted to provide more historic context. So one of the topics that we explore pretty briefly at this point are the free people of color who are engaged in the project. We know that free people of color worked here, free Black people. It's just difficult to distinguish in some of the historic records who was a white person working here and who was a free person of color. So unless we're able to verify in other sources that this was a free person of color, that we're seeing referenced in places like the time books and other things, it's just a bit harder to identify them. So we have identified a few free people of color who were working here, but that is something that we absolutely hope to expand in the future, learn more about those individuals, present their stories here as well.
Yeah, and to add to that, this work is never complete. As you all will notice going through our website, is we are building narratives, we are building these stories, and the more sources we can get provides more that we can add to these narratives. But this work is something that is has been rewarding, I think, for all of us, to say the least. And we're happy that we're finally able to present this to the public, not just to academics, educators, but to anyone looking to learn more about this type of history.
Okay, so we have another question. Appreciate Josh flagging it for us. What happened to enslaved persons who were confiscated during the Revolution?
So I'm going to turn this over to one of my colleagues. Caroline Waller was the one who processed this series. I'm not sure if the records actually tell us this, and I should maybe emphasize. So like the work that we're doing is like preserving and then describing the types of records to make them available so people can do research. So this may be something where like someone could do a research project similar to what everyone at the state capitol is doing, and then give us more information on that. But Caroline, was there any additional information when you were processing the records that like indicated some of that? Oh, I think. Okay, first, I guess.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Hey, we can hear you.
Hey, sorry. It's really. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So from what I can tell, I think for the most part, the enslaved individuals were auctioned off to the highest bidder, and then the proceeds went back to the state. I haven't studied this area of history a lot, though. So if anyone has any additional information, correct me if I'm wrong.
But, and, as I mentioned before, like we've been keeping track of that Excel spreadsheet to just indicate like where in the folders this information is for enslaved persons who were confiscated during the American Revolution. So if anyone is interested in doing more research in this, we can certainly, help point the way to some of the names and where in the records you'd be able to find this.
Okay, something else in the chat. One of our participants mentioned a website beyondkin.org to document stories of the enslaved. That I think the initiative's been started by descendants of enslaved. Are you all aware of it? Is there any way to connect with that group or program?
I'm not familiar with it, but and that's a wonderful resource. We'll look into that. I will say, we know that there are a lot of projects that are similar to this one. We certainly did not, create the wheel on this. We were inspired by a lot of other projects, notably like the naming project at Montpelier, at James Madison's Montpelier. The White House Historical Association has a great resource, Slavery in the President's Neighborhood. And we recently just saw the University of Alabama has a forget the name of it, but you can Google it. All important, all really similar in a way to this project. So it's been exciting to see different institutions putting together this kind of work, and you know, from different stripes of life. As far as we know, we're the only state capital that has embarked on a project like this, but we'd love to see more. So we'll look into connecting with that resource. Thank you.
And I actually am fairly familiar with that resource. I learned about it recently this fall at a symposium at Clemson University. That is, from my understanding, and anyone can correct me, it's for descendants to post about their ancestors, which is a wonderful platform. But it's for descendants. So I think it's something that if we ever get to a point where we connect with the descendant group and they feel empowered to tell their ancestor stories, I think that's a conversation we could have. But I think it's really great for individuals, especially when they can have that connection with their kin to share their story. So I think that's a great opportunity for anyone. If you're online right now and you think you want to share your story, your narrative, that would be a great platform to use as well. But we are excited to hear from descendant groups. So if you see a name that you're familiar with, or you recognize a surname or a person, please feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is on the page right here. And we would be happy to start a new narrative.
All right, well, I think that note is a great note to conclude with, just to invite people to explore what's there, but also to add stories that you know of. And so thank you, Natalie, Tara, Kara, and Alex. This has been a great panel. I love hearing about creative ways people are using our collections. And we thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.